Alright students, so in this video we'll be going through the practice paper that we went through in class. So this video is just for you to check your understanding, check whether you got the right answers, as well as to perhaps learn some content along the way. So without further ado, let's move on. So in the first part of your practice paper, the questions that you will actually get are questions that are related to flooding, and the second part talks about housing. So let's go through the flooding questions first. Remember, at any point of time, if I'm going too fast or if you do not understand anything, feel free to pause the video and go back to make sure that you understood what was mentioned in the previous sections before moving on. So the first question is, describe the extent of flooding as shown in figure 1. So we have to talk about figure 1 because they are asking us to look at this piece of data here. So what you see is a map about flooding that happened in the United States. So the command word describe actually requires you to tell me what you see in the map, and extent refers to how serious something. So in other words, how serious was the flooding in the United States here? Alright, so for this question, you can apply GAD here. So GAD stands for General Anomaly and Data. For those of you who do not know what anomalies are, basically, anomalies are things that do not follow the general trend or are out of the ordinary. In our line graphs, we see that anomaly stands for things such as if there is a general increase and then there's a sudden decrease, then that counts as an anomaly. However, if you're still confused about how to use get, or you need a sample answer of how get answers using get looks like, go on to SLS and watch the video there to refresh your knowledge about get. Alright, so since I've mentioned that we can use get, let me demonstrate to you how we will actually use get here. So firstly, the G, general. So we see that flooding centers around Missouri River, affecting many states. So we see here the Missouri River is here, and the areas that are affected are around the Missouri River. Therefore, we can say that flooding centers around the Missouri River. Also, another acceptable answer would be if you said that flooding happens in the central part of the United States. That's also acceptable because we see that these areas are actually the central areas of the United States. Alright, so then after we have mentioned the general trend of which areas are affected, you want to include your data because remember we have to make reference to the figure. So in this question, we would actually quote the different names of areas, the different states which were affected by the flood. So the entire state of Iowa is inundated. So the meaning of the word inundated means flooding. It's just a more geographical term to the word flooding. So the entire state of Iowa is inundated along with parts of Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Illinois. So this is what constitutes general as well as data. So for this answer here, you will actually get 2 marks. So you tell me generally what happened and then you give me data, so that's 1 mark each. Alright, moving on. So the next question gives us this scenario. There was a high record of snowfall in the Rocky Mountains in Montana. Explain how this could lead to a major flood in the states around the Missouri River. So over here we see they are asking us to identify a cause of flooding. So we see a record of snowfall in the Rocky Mountains in Montana. So based on the studies that you have done, snowfall, how does it lead to flooding? So for those of you who mentioned about snow melt, so when snow melts and then it becomes water, where does this water go? How does it lead to major floods around the Missouri River? So this is a worth 2 marks question, therefore you need 2 points. So let me just read out to you the answer. When there is an increase in temperature or change in seasons, the large amount of snow may melt and flow into the Missouri River. So this just tells me about snow melt. Next, I have to tell you why snow melt leads to major floods. Because snow can melt but does not lead to flooding. So you need to mention to me how does snow melt lead to flooding. The snowmelt increases the amount of water in the Missouri River and causes the river to overflow its banks and flood the surrounding areas. So this is another mark for explaining to me how floods occur due to snowmelt. Alright, in the next question, name and describe another type of flood that may occur in the cities of Iowa. So in the first part of the question, we actually said that the flood centered around areas near the Missouri River, right? So what kind of floods usually happen near rivers? Well, if you said that river floods happen near rivers, you're absolutely right. So then that leaves us with two other types of flood that we have learned throughout our lessons. First, firstly, it's coastal floods. Secondly, it's flash floods. So ask yourself, are there any coastal areas near Iowa? So Iowa is here, right beside the Missouri River. You would see that there are no coastal areas. It's actually an inland area. Therefore, coastal areas are definitely out. That coastal floods are definitely out. So that leaves us with the final type of flood, which are flash floods. So this question is worth 3 marks. You need to tell me and then you need to describe to me the type of flood. So by telling me the name of the flood, that will be 1 mark. And then the description is another 2 marks. So then you have to tell me what is this other type of flood. So for example, the answer would sound like flash floods, full stop. When there is rainfall of high intensity, large amounts of water accumulates due to the presence of large built-up cities with concrete surfaces, such as Illinois, Iowa, which makes it difficult for water to infiltrate the ground. So when water does not infiltrate the ground, it does not go into the ground, it actually flows on the surface as surface runoff. So when it flows as surface runoff, it actually leads to your channel capacity being filled and eventually being exceeded, which causes flash floods. Alright, so moving on to the next question, with reference to your own studies. So while the previous question asks you to make reference to the map that they gave you, when you get questions that says with reference to your own studies, you actually need to use the examples or the things that you have learned during geography lessons in school. So with reference to your own studies, explain 2 social impacts of floods experienced by people living in these affected areas. So remember, they're asking you for social impacts. There are 2 types of impacts that we have learned in class. Firstly is social impact, secondly is economic impact. So please make sure that you do not confuse these 2. So you need to state to me 2 social impacts and then explain them. So stating is just simply telling me, for example, deaths, full stop. That is stating. Explaining, however, is telling me how do floods actually cause death. So you have to tell me the whole process of how floods lead eventually to death. Alright, so social impacts is basically referring to the well-being of people, and as we have learned, physical and mental well-being are affected when floods happen. So these are the possible answers. So injuries and spread of diseases. So this question is worth 4 marks. So you have to make sure that you write enough for this question. So in injuries and spread of diseases, floodwater may cause building to collapse, causing physical injuries to people who are trapped under the rubble. So rubble refers to the, for example, concrete that has fallen and broken after the collapse of a particular building. So that's the meaning of rubble. So stagnant pools of floodwater may encourage mosquitoes, leading to increased incidence of diseases such as malaria. So that is the spread of diseases. So I'm explaining to you how these impacts happen because of flooding. So next we have homelessness. So floodwater may sweep houses away, causing people to stay in emergency shelters, or you can say that floodwater may sweep houses away, leaving people with no houses to live in. So that's also perhaps acceptable, okay? So let's take a look at the next question. This is also a question that involves data. However, the type of data that we are given is different. It is not a visual kind of data. It's more of a textual data, meaning that it is a story from somewhere. So with reference to figure 2, explain the reason why Beijing is prone to flooding. So you need to identify the factor that causes Beijing to flood. So this, if you were to find this in your textbook, this will be under the section of why are some cities more prone to flooding. Alright, so the answer is here. They poured money into building of massive dams, whereas urban drainage infrastructure was by and large neglected. So it means that they built big dams. However, the drainage system, for example, your canals, your drains in the city, weren't really developed. So when it rained, these infrastructures were the channel capacity of these infrastructures was exceeded easily, causing floods to happen. I noticed that also some of you actually mentioned that the government began to recognize the problem of flooding in the late 1990s after a massive flood along the Yangtze River killed thousands of people. However, the policymaker in Beijing regarded it largely as a rural problem. So, you would identify this factor as proximity to water bodies, right? So, however, it is incorrect because in the text here, it says that it is a rural problem. Beijing is actually an urban area, much like Singapore, and therefore it isn't really a rural area, and therefore it is not the factor that we are looking for. So you have to keep your eyes peeled, as well as knowing about the different possible factors that you can talk about. So this is just one mark, so you just have to tell me why is it prone to flooding. So Beijing is prone to floods because the canals and rivers are unable to cope with the high surface runoff in a built-up city. Alright, in 2b, some cities are more prone to floods compared to others. So again, this is related to the key question of why are some areas more prone to flooding? So explain two other factors that increase the risk of flooding in these cities. So remember, they are not asking you for causes of floods, which is your high rainfall, your snow melt, your failure of man-made structure. No, they are not asking for that. They are asking for you, why are some cities more likely to flood as compared to others? So for this section, you would actually mention factors such as low-lying land, lack of permeability of surfaces, and proximity to water bodies. So these are things that cause cities to be more vulnerable to flooding. So some cities are prone to floods due to height above sea level. These cities are more prone to flooding as water from river channels, canals, or the sea can easily overflow onto these areas during periods of intense rainfall. Alright, so another point, students are often confused between causes as well as why some cities are more prone to flooding. A simple way in which you can remember this is that if you have a low-lying land but you do not have any rainfall, will the area still flood? The answer is no. So low-lying land without rain, it doesn't flood. So low-lying land is not a cause, but rather it makes flooding more likely. So you must be able to separate these two things when you are doing your revision. Another acceptable answer is proximity to water bodies. So when cities are located close to water bodies such as river channels, canals, or the sea, they are more prone to flooding as these channels may overflow, causing large amounts of water to be deposited onto land that is normally dry. So it means that, for example, if you're living near a reservoir compared to you living in a desert, which area is more likely to flood? If you mention that the reservoir area is more likely to flood because you are near water, then you are absolutely right. Alright, so there are other possible answers in which why some cities are more prone to flooding. So as long as you get whatever that you have in your textbook, for example, the lack of permeable surfaces, that would be an acceptable answer. But you have to mention to me, why does this increase the probability of floods or increase the vulnerability of areas to floods? Okay, so discuss the advantages and disadvantages of evacuation drills in reducing the impacts of floods. So you guys did not study about evacuation drills. You were not taught or tested about evacuation drills. However, I will just go through this question for you to learn this on top of the information that you have known. Remember, what you have been taught with regards to disaster preparedness is forecasting and warning measures. So let's take a look at the requirements of the question. So discuss, remember, discuss, you must provide both sides of the story, similar to evaluation, and then you have to provide to me the advantages and disadvantages of the evacuation drills. So firstly, when you have evacuation drills, when you prepare people even before the flooding event happens, people are educated on what to do after a warning is given. So they do not panic, they do not scramble and then end up being buried under the rubble. And then secondly, it enables cities to improve on their flood evacuation plan. So imagine you carry out your evacuation drills and then you find out that, hey, actually my drill is not very efficient because people are crowding around a particular area. So then it allows you to improve on your evacuation plan and make changes such that you reduce the amount of crowds in a particular area so that people can be dispersed easily. However, there are disadvantages. People may not participate, for example, and this reduces the effectiveness of the evacuation drill. Also, it depends on the level of preparedness of people. So if they do not see floods as a threat, they do not really want to participate. And when floods happen, they would be unprepared and the social and economic impacts will actually be very great. Alright, so now we go on to the topic of housing. So this question here, define housing shortage. So the command word of define is basically tell me the meaning of housing shortage. Housing shortage is defined as a situation when the demand for housing exceeds its supply. Therefore, there is insufficient housing to accommodate the population in an area. It means that there is just simply not enough houses for all the people living in the urban area. That is what housing shortage is. Explain how rural-urban migration leads to housing shortage. So when I use the command word explain, it means giving a detailed account of how something happens. For example, how does A lead to B? So how does urban-rural migration lead to housing shortage? So here's a graphic to explain to you how rural-urban migration leads to housing shortage. So on the left, you have a rural area. On the right, you have an urban area. So in rural areas, we know that there may be lack of jobs, and in urban areas, there's abundant opportunities. So lack of jobs are push factors. They actually push people away from rural areas, and abundant jobs attract people to a particular area. Therefore, they pull people. So you need to know and you need to mention pull and push factors when you're talking about rural-urban migration. So when you have job opportunities, people in the rural area ask themselves and say, hey, I think I want to go and get a better job. So I want to move to urban areas or I want to move to cities. So when they move to cities, over here you see 2 houses, but now there are 4 people. So how are they going to be accommodated? So this leads to the problem of housing shortage if the government is unable to build houses fast enough. So another thing to note is also the affordability of housing. If houses are unaffordable, so these people cannot afford to stay in these homes within the urban area, this actually may lead to problems of slums and squatter settlements. Alright, so this is an explanation of how rural-urban migration leads to housing shortage. It is a 4-mark question, so you have to make sure that you write sufficient points, 4 points, okay? So rural-urban migration refers to movement of people from rural areas into cities to live and work. That is the definition of rural-urban migration. Push factors, which are undesirable qualities in rural areas, such as lack of job opportunities, lead to rural inhabitants wanting to leave. So these are your push factors. Abundant job opportunities in cities forms pull factors, attracting these rural migrants. Because of this large influx refers to rush. So because of this large rush or large introduction of migrants, cities are unable to build houses quick enough to house them. Demand for housing exceeds supply, hence causing housing shortage. Alright, so if you don't understand how rural-urban migration works, please rewind this video and watch it slowly and make sure that you understand it before you move on. Alright, so using figure 2, identify the impact of housing shortage. So we see a picture here, photograph of an impact of housing shortage. So remember, they're asking you to use figure 2, so you have to make reference to the picture. So my answer would sound something like, the impact illustrated by figure 2 is homelessness as we see a man or a person sleeping on a sidewalk. So if a person has a home, they will usually sleep in their home, right? So you wouldn't sleep on the sidewalk. So there is a high probability that this man is homeless. So describe how the impact of housing shortage in figure 2 can affect an individual's health. So how can homelessness affect an individual's health? That is the question that you have to answer. For example, homelessness can have negative impact on the individual's health because they ask you to describe how the impact of housing shortage can affect an individual's health. Can it affect an individual's health in a positive way? Can it affect an individual's health in a negative way? So 1 mark to tell me whether it's positive or negative. And then secondly, you tell me the description. So this is because they do not have access to safe shelter and are hence exposed to hunger, lack of sleep, the cold and the rain. So when you're exposed to all these elements, it actually results in ailments, which means illnesses such as skin infections and stress disorders. So describe the impact of water pollution in slums and squatter settlements. So what does water pollution cause? They're not asking you what causes water pollution, but they're asking you what does water pollution cause? So what are the impacts of water pollution? So for example, rivers near slum areas may be used for washing, garbage and sewage disposal, resulting in contaminants being introduced into the river. So I'm telling you what water pollution is. So this can result in the spread of diseases since bacteria is introduced into the river or the water body, resulting in illnesses such as cholera, dysentery if the water is consumed by individuals. Alright, so in this question, we're talking about impacts. So please make sure that you are able to describe the impacts of the different factors that we mentioned in the topic of housing. So then explain how the lack of access to clean water leads to low levels of health. So why does a person have low levels of health when he or she has lack of access to clean water? This is a simple question. So when people do not have access to clean water, they may actually use contaminated water from other sources such as polluted rivers or contaminated wells. So bacteria may have already been introduced in this water source, and this water source are contaminated. So because this water contains bacteria, when they consume it, it leads to diseases and hence low level of health. So explain how land pollution in slums and squatter settlements lead to low levels of health. So in this series of questions, they're basically asking you to explain how the conditions within a slum and squatter settlements actually affect the health of individuals living there. So land pollution may be caused by improper garbage disposal into drains or near homes. So when you have these rubbish that's being thrown away in a haphazard manner, they actually become a collecting ground of stagnant water, and this becomes a place where mosquitoes can breed, causing diseases such as malaria, which causes low levels of health when people get infected. Okay, so explain with an example how self-help schemes benefit people living in slums. So for this question, you will not be tested during your end of the year exam. However, do feel free to pause the video and just take a look at the answers and check whether you guys have this question, this answer as shown in the slide. Alright, in this question we're given another set of data, which is a line graph. So using figure 3, meaning we have to make reference to figure 3, describe the trend of the percentage of Singapore's population living in HDB flats from 1960 to 2013. So we see here in 1960 it was 9% of Singapore's population living in HDB, but in 2013 we see that 82% of Singaporeans live in HDB. So generally, when questions require you to describe trends, you have to use GAD, okay, general anomaly and data. So let's take a look at basically trend means patterns, all right? So how many patterns do you see? Let's take a look. Generally, is it increasing or decreasing? From 9 to 82, is that an increase or a decrease? Well, that is an increase. Do we see an anomaly here? So if we say that generally it is increasing, it means that it has to increase all the way from 1960 to 2013. So every single date, for example 1960 to 1965, from one date to another, it must be increasing. However, what we are seeing here is an anomaly, because after 1990, what we start seeing is that it starts decreasing. So this is your anomaly. It is out of the ordinary from your general trend, which is an increasing trend. So your answer would sound something like this. Remember, you have to quote data from the figure. Generally, from 1960 to 2013, there has been an increasing trend in the percentage population of Singaporeans living in HDB flats. However, from 1990 to 2013, the percentage decreased from 87 to 82%. So for this, in generally, if you want to further improve your answer, give me data. So what do I mean by giving me data? So you'll tell me in 1960 it was 9%, but in 2013 it was 82%. So give one reason why Singapore has been successful in providing its people with public housing. So Singapore has been successful because it provides public housing which is affordable and caters to all income groups. This means that regardless of how much you earn, there is a high likelihood that you will be able to afford the different types of houses uh, that are built by HDB. So these different types of houses have different number of rooms, for example, they're in different neighborhoods, and all of this affect the cost of the public housing unit. So explain how a strong sense of place and belonging contributes to inclusive housing. So we know that one of the characteristics of inclusive housing is that there is a strong sense of place and belonging. So now we have to ask ourselves, how does this actually contribute to inclusive housing? So when we have a strong sense of belonging, it means that we value the place. It means that we feel that this place, we identify this place as being a homely location, something that we attach meaning to. So when you have inclusive housing, people will be more likely to actively contribute to the community because you feel that you belong to this particular area, therefore you want to give back, you want to be involved in the community. So having experienced pleasant memories and experiences, individuals will try to ensure that everyone feels at home, leading to inclusive housing. So if you feel that a particular area is homely, you want to make sure that everyone else also feels welcome. So this results in inclusive housing, which is housing that in which everyone is included. So that is the end of the video. Remember, if you missed any parts, feel free to go back to the video and watch the different sections. Please revise your work and make sure that you are absolutely ready before 8 October, which is the exam date. I wish you all the best, and please remember to rest.